Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, how North African nations round up thousands of migrants and dump them in the desert.
The whole point is that they make people live in a constant state of discomfort and fear.
A new investigation documents systemic police abuse against people migrating to Europe, all with the backing of a not-so-silent partner, the European Union. I'm Kevin Hurtin, and this is The Take. June 20th marks World Refugee Day. It's a day meant to celebrate the strength and the courage of people who have been forced to flee their home country to escape conflict or persecution. But in that celebration, there's a gray area. People seeking refuge who may not meet the legal definition of refugee, asylum seekers, and migrants. Meanwhile, migration management is front and center, particularly in North Africa.
The European Union has asked North African countries to do more to stop migrants headed north to Europe.
They get picked up off the streets, detained, and banished in the middle of nowhere.
I'm reporting live from the desert, and as you can see, this is the convoy going over there. And it's a massive convoy, massively deporting blacks to a no man's land where anything can happen. You got women and children into these trucks.
Now, though, we know what's happening, and crucially, who's footing the bill.
My name is Beatriz de Silva, and I'm an investigative reporter at Lighthouse Reports. I'm based in Barcelona. And Lighthouse Reports is a collaborative investigative newsroom. We led this investigation along with 8 media partners and 40 journalists over the course of a year.
Thank you very much, Beatriz. Maybe we start with one man's story to help illustrate this phenomenon of desert dumps. He's a 38-year-old Cameroonian man named Franois. Can you tell us his story?
Yeah, sure. So Franois is one of the 50 survivors of these operations that we spoke to. And his story is particularly striking because, unlike many people we spoke to, he was actually able to keep his phone during a long ordeal where he was intercepted at sea when trying to reach Europe and subsequently dumped in the desert. Franois, along with his wife and his 6-year-old stepson, were intercepted by the Tunisian Coast Guard at sea in September with a group of people, which included 2 pregnant women, and they were en route to Europe. So they were quite close to shore when, in the early hours, he was intercepted by a Tunisian National Guard patrol vessel, and they were taken to shore to a port where he said migrants were beaten with sticks. About 300 people were loaded onto buses by armed guards and driven for hours inland, and he filmed part of this. And then later at a border post, Franois himself, along with his wife and his young stepson, were separated from this group and put, along with 30 other people, into pickup trucks and dumped in like a desert area a few kilometers from the Algerian border. And this was around 4 a.m. when this happened. And at that point, the Tunisian guards demanded that they cross into Algeria. But as they were walking into Algerian forces fired warning shots. So they had to turn back to Tunisia. And so at this point, they have no jackets. People had just come from being at sea. There was no food, no water. They were again rounded up by the Tunisian authorities who drove them further north into the country and dumped them in the middle of nowhere. I mean, what is often that people tell us is that their phones are taken, their shoes are taken, all their belongings are taken. So the really great thing that Franois was able to record what happened to him.
We started praying to find someone to give us water. That's when it gets difficult, when you start hallucinating about things you should have naturally.
So we were able to verify his testimony by matching the GPS tracking on his phone with images and videos that he captured during what ended up being 9 days where he and his family were left to their own devices in remote and desert areas. Franois said he was begging for bread and water for days. At one point, he is violently assaulted in one village. And so he has to kind of go off-road back into these desert areas where he says he then begins to hallucinate because this has been days and days of walking.
Wow.
So essentially, he and his family were left to fend for their lives.
This is not just repatriating people back to their country of origin. This is just taking people and then sometimes just putting them 300 kilometers back to where they may have started or someplace. It's just pushing them back a little bit. But is it about inflicting enough trauma to make the trip not worth it?
Essentially, I mean, the purpose is to make people's lives in this constant limbo and this constant state of danger.
This is a sentiment that's echoed by one EU staffer who works at the EU's Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, which is a financial instrument created to address the root causes of irregular migration. It's where the biggest share of money for so-called migration management goes to. The report quotes the staffer, saying, "You have to make migrants' lives difficult, complicate their lives. If you leave a migrant from Guinea in the Sahara twice, the third time, he will ask you to voluntarily bring him back home."
People are left in areas that are of risk to their own lives. So, yeah, it's quite violent.
Yeah, and I mean, there's such an overt racial element to this. Senior officials in Tunisia, Morocco, and Mauritania all deny racial motivation for these abductions. They say it's about migration management, but that defense really is undermined by the story of an American citizen, Timothy Hucks, who was abducted on the streets of the Moroccan capital of Rabat. Can you just tell us briefly about Hucks and what that tells you about the overt racial component of this?
Yeah, so Timothy Hucks is a 33-year-old U.S. citizen who was arrested by plainclothes officers just a few meters from his home in Rabat, and this was back in 2019. So he recalls this happening and how he showed his American driver's license and even offered to go back home to get his passport, but he was just immediately handcuffed by an officer and shoved into the back of a white van. So after this, he's taken to a police station, along with what he describes are around 40 Black men. They're crammed together in this dirty room. The security forces took his fingerprints, they took his photos, they started asking him accusatory questions, asking him if he's a terrorist, and he just describes this utmost anger about what is happening. He hasn't been offered any due process. He's then transported along with these other men to a town that's about 200 kilometers south of Rabat, where his home is, and he's just abandoned there.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that, how dare you arrest an American? It's that it really does look like they're finding Black faces, locking them up, and driving them out into the middle of the desert. It seems as simple as that.
Yeah, so obviously, Hucks eventually finds a bus to take him back to Rabat, but what his case confirms is that these operations are the result of blatant racial profiling. His case is obviously exemplary of that and of the impunity with which these security forces are operating in these countries. They routinely arrest tens of thousands of people per year across Morocco, and they receive millions from the EU. And so many other people we spoke to, they had residency permits and they intended to live in Morocco, but these situations just make their lives quite impossible.
Where does this leave Black nationals in these three countries, like Tunisia, Morocco, and Mauritania?
So it essentially leaves people in this constant state of insecurity and fear. So for instance, we spoke to a man who said that he was now afraid to go out to the supermarket just to buy a loaf of bread. In many cases, the people we spoke to have residency permits. They want to live in these countries, but this has been made near impossible by the constant profiling and the subsequent violence of these operations. And just back to what the EU sources told us, the whole point is that they make people live in a constant state of discomfort and fear.
After the break, Europe's knee-deep complicity in the desert dumps. Over the past years, the belt stretching from Africa, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea, has been mired in political turmoil.
6 countries in West and Central Africa have had military takeovers since 2020.
But even in more stable countries, people's livelihoods are endangered by resource extraction, as well as the climate emergency.
Climate change is reshaping the Sahel. Tens of thousands of people have been displaced as a lake in Mali evaporates. What little water there is controlled by armed groups, including Al-Qaeda.
For many, quitting their homeland is the only option left.
Irregular migration to Europe is on the rise, and the EU is attempting to bring down the numbers by courting some of the countries where migrants travel from or travel through.
And that's where the European Union comes in. Beatriz, let's talk about the EU involvement. This is happening in North Africa, but the EU and its border policies are hovering above everything here. What does your reporting reveal about the EU's level of complicity?
So there's two sides to it. There's the awareness that they have that this is happening and the funding. So to the point of awareness, we put through a bunch of freedom of information requests, and obviously we interviewed people inside the EU, and we got access to a series of documents that show that for years the EU has been aware of these practices. There's like one EU Commission document in 2019 where they describe these operations happening in Morocco, and then in the same year they go on to approve a further round of funding in migration. We also got a series of documents from the EU border agency Frontex, where they describe these desert dumps happening, including a European Parliament document where they describe the abusive collective expulsions to Senegal and Mali from Mauritania.
Despite the documentary evidence from sources like the European Commission and the Frontex agency, when confronted with the investigation, the EU denied the issue. This is Ana Pisonero, the EU Commission spokesperson, responding to the investigation's finding.
Our national partners remain sovereign states, and they continue to be in control of their national forces. By the way, they also agree to cooperate on the basis of the respect for international law and human rights. This is what we're trying to work for, and this is why we remain engaged on the ground.
But it's not only the EU's alleged awareness that Beatriz mentioned. The investigative team also followed the money trail.
There's the fact of funding. We found that Tunisian National Guards have been funded with over 1 million euros that was provided by the German Federal Police. In all of the instances in these countries, we were able to match vehicles used during these roundups and expulsions to vehicles that are provided by European countries by identifying tenders and carrying out visual analyses that confirm these matches. So in many instances, these vehicles that are being transported in, they've been funded or provided by the EU.
This investigation, it focused on 3 countries, Tunisia, Morocco, and Mauritania. In Mauritania in particular, investigators filmed a transport vehicle dropping people off at a detention center in the capital. Now, you spoke with one of the women picked up, a 23-year-old named Idiatu.
When we arrived in Gogi, they dropped us and chased us away from their border. They chased us towards the forest in Mali. They chased us as animals and drove their truck back. So we walked through the forest without knowing where to go until we arrived in Mali.
Unlike Francois or Timothy, Idiatu was not just abandoned in the middle of nowhere, but actually dumped on Mauritania's border with Mali, which is an active war zone. Beatriz, can you speak to the dangers that a young woman like Idiatu faces when she's abandoned in the desert like this?
So in January, Idiatu was 23 and her friend Bella were 27. They're 2 friends from Guinea. They were taken to a migrant detention center, like you mentioned, in the Mauritanian capital of Nouakchott. After they had tried to cross by sea to Spain, they were trying to reach the Canary Islands from Mauritania. And so this center has become a transit point used by Mauritanian officials before they move people into the border with Mali. And so what she describes that happened in this detention center is that Spanish police officers took her photograph because before she was forced into a white bus towards the border with Mali. And so reporters on the ground, my colleagues, they actually observed that bus, a white Toyota, as it departed from the center and followed it for a few kilometers where it was going towards Mali. So she and a group of 29 other people are sent away. She recalled fearing that she would be subject to sexual violence, and then they have to walk for 4 days until they manage to reach a village. And eventually, she and her friend Bella find a driver who is able to take them to a relative in Senegal. But what her friend Bella says later is, if I had known that this was going to happen, I would not have tried to go to Europe.
Beatriz mentioned that a Spanish police officer took Idiatu's photo in a detention center in Mauritania. And the investigation also mentions the presence of Spanish policemen in Nouakchott, the capital. Mauritania is 800 kilometers from the Spanish Canary Islands, which are off Africa's coast. We're talking about boots on the ground, rounding up migrants in Africa. This does seem like a new level of complicity that you've revealed here.
Yes, exactly. So in Mauritania, we found that Spanish police officers are working side by side with Mauritanian authorities carrying out these operations. So we were able to witness and film people being brought to the center where Spanish police officers are entering on a regular basis. Spanish police officers are inside this detention center, taking photos of people before they are then rounded up, dumped, and expelled in the border with Mali. And we also found that there are lists of names with the names of people that are about to be deported or about to be dumped in the desert, and that Spanish officials have access to these lists. And Mauritania confirmed that they share this data with Spain. So it's a really close collaboration.
Yeah, look, the presence of the Spanish policeman really does elevate this. I mean, it shows it's no longer deniable. What is it that these North African governments get out of this? This is a big expense. Is it just a money thing? Is it just that they're getting enough money from the EU that it makes it worth it? Or are they keen to keep sub-Saharan Africans out of their countries as well?
It's a mix of both. Certainly, they have been receiving like these millions of euros to enact these operations and other operations to stop people from crossing into Europe. That's in line with Europe's wider border externalization policy. But internally, domestically, there is a lot of racism. So in Tunisia and in Morocco, domestically, there is a desire to keep migrants outside of their countries.
This is Hussein Baoumi, EU advocacy officer at Amnesty International. He's talking about migration deals between North African countries and the EU.
These deals is empowering repressive regimes that are inherently unstable. It's undermining the integration between Africa because it's leading to hostility between North African countries and sub-Saharan African countries as well. Beyond this, it's sadly fueling a lot of xenophobia. It's fueling a lot of anti-Black racism that we have been seeing.
Do you get a sense that people, normal EU citizens, are aware of these measures and are approving of it?
I don't think so at all. I think most people were not aware. It is true there had been last year a series of reporting in Tunisia about these dumps. And then in isolated cases, there are NGO reports in Morocco that mention them. But I don't think it's something that's widely known. I think that's partly why the investigation did get some coverage initially, where a lot of people were shocked. And I think people should be shocked. And we had European elections this month, and a part of also the reason why we wanted to put this reporting out was that people are aware before they go out to exercise their vote that this is what's happening with EU taxpayer money.
What have been the consequences of the report so far?
So far we've seen some early reactions, both at the national level of parliaments and at the EU. So we had parliamentary questions being asked in Dutch Parliament as a result of the investigation. Shortly after our publication, also, a EU commissioner actually grilled Ursula von der Leyen. This is the president of the European Commission, over our findings. He kind of said over our report, he said, this is not Europe, these are not European values, and quoted our investigation. They said they didn't have knowledge that these things were happening, so just a mix of denial, but saying that they were going to look into it. And lastly, in Spain, where there's this really close collaboration that we've been talking about, we had political parties raise our investigation in Congress, and they kind of put a set of questions in Congress, raising questions of the role of Spain's complicity.
The first of these dumps date from 2003 in Morocco. How do you feel like these operations have evolved since then?
We've definitely felt that it's become much more overt and just so systematic. The scale of these operations in all these three countries is immense. there's tens of thousands of people that are rounded up on a yearly basis. So what we understand from our reporting and trailing through these dozens of deals that have been signed is that there's a relationship between the increasing funding and funneling of border management equipment to a rise in these operations. And there does seem, like you say, it's quite overt. And there's really just a lack of accountability mechanisms to stop this from happening.
One of the ways Europe has systematized migration deterrence is through these bilateral agreements with North African countries. Now, critics say their goal is to externalize Europe's borders southwards.
The EU has signed cooperation deals worth hundreds of millions of euros with Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Mauritania, and others, partly aimed at getting them to halt migration into Europe.
There has been a history of cooperation with North Africa, with Europe, as this kind of borderland between sub-Saharan Africa. So, I mean, can they really say, well, we had no idea that this was part of our plan to stop migrants from coming into Europe?
I mean, absolutely not. Again, since at least 2018, they have internal documents and internal communications where they describe these dams, where they are actually raising the flag that these are human rights violations, that this is, in a Frontex document, they mentioned that this is racial profiling. So the EU is beyond aware, and they keep injecting this money into these countries. And what we found is there are no accountability mechanisms or any due process when this money is injected into these migration management programs. So actually, the European Commission has conceded that human rights assessments are not conducted when funding these migration management projects abroad. So it's a flawed system in by itself.
Thank you very much, Beatriz.
Thank you guys for having me.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Marcos Bartolomé, Duha Mossad, and me, Kevin Hurtin, in for Malika Bilal. This episode was edited by Alexandra Locke. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back.